So let's begin today's session. This is week 2, class number 1. Today we are going to start our look at chapter 2. Specifically, we're going to take a look at some of the research methods that are going to be brought up and referred to throughout this course. So it's important to get these fundamentals down and understood so that we can make easier sense of everything that comes later. So specifically, we're going to take a look at some basic terms and definitions today, and I will try to tie them back to some of the things that we have already seen examples of so far. So we're going to take a look at independent and dependent variables, functional relationships, stimulus and responses, overt and covert behavior, appetitive and aversive stimuli, establishing operations, deprivation and satiation, and then contiguity and contingency. And what you'll find is that a lot of these terms have very special meanings in the psychology of learning that might differ from what they are in everyday English language. So it's important to know those distinctions so that we don't make errors by interpreting these the way that we're used to in terms of the English language, but realize that they have special meanings, special definitions for the psychology of learning. And then we're going to take all these terms and we're going to revisit that learned helplessness study to apply and analyze it using these new concepts. All right, so first one we're going to take a look at independent and dependent variables. So before we get into the distinction between independent and dependent variables, it's important to first off establish what is a variable. So a variable is any characteristic of a person, place, or thing that can change, that can basically vary. It's something that is able to be different in different situations. It's able to vary. It's a variable. So a variable is, again, something that can possibly change. So one variable, one characteristic of a person that can be different, both for a single person and for different persons, is something like age. Age is a variable in a lot of psychological studies, and it's a variable because it can be different. You could be a teenager, you could be a young adult, you could be elderly, you could be an infant, right? These are all different values of age, and that is what makes age a variable. Other examples of variables that we're going to encounter in the psychology of learning are things like time. So how much time do you have to complete a particular task? That is a variable. How long is a class that you attend here at IUSB? Some are an hour and 15 minutes. Others are 3 hours long if you're taking, for example, a night course. Those are variable times because they're different times. So time is often a variable or can be a variable in psychology. And other variables that are very oftentimes looked at are performance variables. So if I give an exam, different students are going to get different scores. The score that is achieved on that exam is a variable. It can change. It can be different. Excuse me. So variables are anything that can change. And then they are split into two main groups for psychology so that we can understand what causes what effects. So the two different major types of variables that we're going to be looking at are independent and dependent variables. And an independent variable, this is a variable that is manipulated in an experiment. So this is a variable that the experimenter themselves controls. It's a variable that the experimenter themselves somehow either changes or somehow controls. So they're in charge of that particular variable. So they can either directly manipulate it or they can systematically vary it across different conditions in the experiment. So I'll give you an example first of a variable that can be directly manipulated. And that could be, if you were interested in the effects of time on performance, you could see how an independent variable of time affects performance by you yourself manipulating the time that somebody has in order to complete a task. So if I was interested in the effect of time on exam performance, I might take one of my classes and I might say, you have the entire class period to complete this exam. You have 1 hour and 15 minutes. That's your time. For another class, I might manipulate that variable and say, you only get 30 minutes to complete this exam. And for another class, I might say, you only receive 15 minutes to do this exam. So importantly, I'm the one that's manipulating the time. I'm the one that's saying, you get 1 hour and 15, you get 30 minutes, you get 15 minutes. So that makes the time an independent variable, and I'm looking at what are the effects of time on performance. How does time change the performance of individuals on these exams? So the independent variable is manipulated by the experimenter. The other kind of type of independent variable that still qualifies as an independent variable is one that is systematically varied across different conditions in the environment, or systematically varied across different conditions, in the experiment. So that systematically means that the experimenter is still in control, even though they cannot or do not directly manipulate it. So let's say that I decided not to go and restrict how long students have for their particular exam. Let's say that I decided correctly that that would be rather mean of me to actually do. How can I still vary time, but in this case I wouldn't actually be manipulating it? Well, what I could do is I could go around and I could ask different professors, how long do you give your students for their particular exams? And I could find a professor that says, oh, I give them 30 minutes for my exam. And I could find another professor that says, oh, I give them the full class period for my exam. And I could find another professor that says, oh, I book extra time for my exams. And then I would keep the students in the 30-minute exam. Their data would be separate from the ones in the hour and 15 minutes. Their data would be separate from the ones in the 2 hours. So in this case, I'm not manipulating time. I'm not manipulating that, but I'm systematically keeping it organized across different conditions. I got a half-hour condition. I got an hour and 15-minute condition. I got a 2-hour condition, even if I didn't manipulate that myself for this particular experiment. So sometimes you have the choice of whether or not you can manipulate an independent variable. So sometimes you have the choice, like with the time for an exam, where you can say, all right, I'm either going to manipulate this myself, and you guys get 30 minutes, you guys get an hour and 15, you guys get 2 hours, or I can systematically vary it, where I find people who are already in the 30-minute condition, I find people already in the hour and 15-minute condition, and I keep them separate, their data separate. That's oftentimes what happens with independent variables, but there's other variables that you can't manipulate. And one of the big ones that is oftentimes studied in psychology is age. So I cannot manipulate age. I can't bring subjects into a lab and say, you're 13 and I'm going to magically transform you to 3 years old, and I'm going to magically transform you to 80 years old. I can't manipulate age. But you can still study age by, again, systematically controlling or controlling that particular variable. So I can recruit subjects, and I can put all the teenagers into one group. And I can put all the young adults into group number 2. And I can put all the elderly individuals in group number 3. And I can put all the infants in group number 4. So I'm not manipulating anything, but I'm still systematically keeping them in groups so I can look at the independent variable of age. Any questions on independent variables before we get to the counterpart dependent? All right. So the other category is dependent variables. And dependent variables, they're the ones that are measured in an experiment. And that sometimes I find is a little bit confusing because everything oftentimes is measured in an experiment. So let's go back to the previous example just real quick. If I want to split people up into different ages, when they come into my lab, I'm going to ask them, how old are you? And if the person says, oh, I'm 16, I'm going to be like, all right, you go into the teenager group. And if the person says, oh, I'm 22, I'm going to say, okay, you go into the young adult group. And if the person says, oh, I'm 65, I'm going to say, all right, you go into the elderly group. And if the parent says, my child is 3 months old, I'm going to say, okay, they go into the infant group. By simply asking them, how old are you, I've measured their age. So sometimes I find that this definition of the dependent variable is a little bit confusing because you measure everything in an experiment. It's better to think of it in terms of this is the variable that is allowed to freely change. It's allowed to be freely varied. And better than that, it's the variable that is dependent on the subject and the subject's performance. So this variable is dependent on the subject's performance. Their age is not dependent on their performance, right? They can't try harder and become 25 if they're 16, right? They can't do that. It's not based on their performance. If I put them into the 30-minute condition, nothing that they do determines whether or not they go into the 30-minute condition. All they do is I tell them, look, you're in the 30-minute condition. That's why those variables are independent, because they're independent of the subject's behavior. However, the dependent variable, that's what we're looking at as the effect. That's what is dependent on how the subject does. So if I have, and that's allowed to vary freely. So if I'm looking at the effects of time on exam performance, the individual's exam performance is dependent on them. They can either do well on the exam, they can do poorly on the exam, they could decide that 30 minutes is completely unfair and I'm not going to answer a single question, or they can decide that 30 minutes I'm going to do my best and I'm going to try to answer every question, or they can say 30 minutes, I have no chance, I'm just going to put C's all the way down for the multiple choice questions, right? It's dependent on what they decide to do. So the dependent variable is the one that we just sit back and we allow it to vary freely. We allow them to do whatever they want in this particular experiment, and it's just what happens, what do they do, it's dependent on the particular subject. So again, performance would be a dependent variable that is dependent on how that subject actually does in that experiment. All right, so any questions on dependent variables? Another way to look at it is that an independent variable can be considered a cause, and a dependent variable is considered the effect. So the cause is what you set up as an experimenter, the effect is what you're trying to find out as an experimenter. All right, so this leads us to functional relationships. And a functional relationship is a relationship between your independent variable and your dependent variable. It's the effect or the phenomenon that we're trying to establish. We want to know if we change the effect, if we change the cause, I got it backwards. If we change the cause, what does that do to the particular effect? So if we change the time that somebody has to perform an exam, what does that do to their performance in that particular exam? And there is a functional relationship between those where if you have, and you can oftentimes graph a functional relationship. So if you have time increasing in that way, and you have percent increasing that way, then the functional relationship between this independent variable of time and this dependent variable of percentage on an exam would be something like that, where increasing time is going to lead to increasing exam scores up to a point where added time is not going to do anything to improve the scores on the exam. If you had 5 hours to do an exam, you're not really going to do much better than if you after the first 3 hours. So this would be the functional relationship between time, for example, and performance on an exam. And that is what psychology, at its heart, is oftentimes all about. Finding these functional relationships, finding these relationships between some cause and some effect, some independent variable and some dependent variable. So if we were to take a look at, for example, another functional relationship between age and if we had something like, let me think, working memory. All right, so working memory is your ability to keep information in your head so you can manipulate it. Basically, if you're trying to remember a phone number, you're using your working memory. If you're trying to remember directions to somewhere, you're using your working memory. Those are two kind of classic examples. And we're taking a look at age. What's the functional relationship? Well, when you're born, you don't have any working memory, almost, right? Try to tell a child a phone number. Try to tell a baby a phone number and see if they tell you back, right? They can't even remember what a number is, let alone have that as a working memory. So they would have almost no working memory whatsoever. As you get older, your working memory increases. Let's get this a little bit higher because it increases rather quickly. Your working memory would increase, and then it basically just kind of stays stable until it takes a little bit of a dip as you get into your elderly golden years. So this would be another functional relationship between age and working memory. And there are different functional relationships between different variables. So if we take a look at age and something like crystallized intelligence, so working memory is like fluid intelligence, right? How much brain power do you have to bring to any situation in a new situation, something that you haven't learned before? Crystallized intelligence is how much knowledge do you have to bring to a particular situation when that you've encountered before. It's kind of like the sum of your world's knowledge that you're bringing to any particular situation. And not surprisingly, elderly people score highest on crystallized intelligence, followed by young adults, followed by teenagers, and then once again, the infants coming in at the end. No crystallized intelligence whatsoever. So again, these relationships are these functional relationships, and they're the relationships between this independent variable of age and this dependent variable of crystallized intelligence, which again is dependent on what the subject is actually able to do. All right, and those functional relationships, again, that's what we're looking for in psychology. We want to know, especially in psychology, we want to know what does a change in one variable cause in another variable. So what does a change in how you present information cause in terms of learning outcomes? What does a change in size of a classroom cause in terms of learning outcomes? These are all things that you would be considering if you, for example, pursued educational psychology. In developmental psychology, what is the functional relationship as age changes? What occurs to things like crystallized intelligence? What occurs to things like a sense of self? What occurs to things like resiliency to depression? What occurs to things like the ability to remember events, the ability to list past events? What are the relationships between all this? That's what a psychologist wants to know. That's what we're going to be looking at a lot when we're looking at theories of learning in this course. All right, so that was functional relationships. The next thing that we're going to take a look at is stimulus and response. So independent variables, dependent variables, functional relationships, those are true of like psychology in general and really science in general. Now we're going to get into the terms that are more learning specific. So stimulus and response is our first very learning specific terms here. And a stimulus is defined as any event that can potentially influence behavior. And a response is a particular instance of behavior. So it's very important to remember that a stimulus can be and is defined as any event that can potentially influence behavior. So we have our classic stimuli, things like flashes of light, things like tones, sounds, snapping fingers, sirens outside, but it can be any event. It's that broad. So a facial expression can be a stimulus. A change in temperature, temperature of the room can be a stimulus. How much sleep you got last night could be a stimulus. It could be an event that could potentially influence behavior. So it is a very broad definition of what a stimulus is. And it's also a behavior can be a particular stimulus. So how somebody behaves towards you could be a stimulus that could influence your behavior. How you're behaving right now could be a stimulus that influences your future behavior. So it really is a very, very broad term. A response, on the other hand, is a particular instance of a behavior. And that's a particularly important thing to remember, is that it's a particular instance, not just behavior in general, but a particular instance in behavior. So when we start going into classical conditioning, and when we start going into operational conditioning, you'll see that we're going to define the responses that we're looking for, and we're going to analyze the responses that we're looking for. What that means is we're going to define particular instances of behavior that we're going to analyze and see how they change. The reason for that is because animals, humans, dogs, pigeons, we're very complicated beings. We have tons of behavior that is occurring. You can't possibly try to analyze everything all the time. So we will focus in on a particular behavior. So when we go to classical conditioning, a response would be something like a dog salivating. That's a particular behavior we're interested in. When we go to operational conditioning, the classic response is the rat pressing the bar. That's the response that we're interested in. So a response is that particular instance of behavior. All right, covert and overt behavior. These are two important distinctions, especially if you were a if you were a hardcore behaviorist, you would, if you were super hardcore, you would deny the existence of covert behaviors. If you were less hardcore, you would just say that they're outside the realm of science. If you're a cognitive psychologist, you oftentimes are very interested in these covert behaviors. So let's take a look at what they are. First, we'll deal with the simpler one, overt behavior. And an overt behavior, this is any behavior, any action that has the potential of being directly observed by any individual other than the one that is performing the action. And that potential is the key thing to remember here. So an overt behavior isn't a behavior that is observed. It's any behavior that has the potential to be observed. So if you go into the middle of a stadium and you start singing a song, that's a very clear instance of overt behavior, because your song is being directly observed by people other than you, right? People are hearing your song. That's a direct observation of this behavior. But if you're shy and you've got stage fright, and you like to sing, but you don't sing when anybody is around, and you make sure that the house is empty, the doors are locked, your soundproof room is all insulated, and that's the only time that you sing, that is still an overt behavior. So even though you're hiding it, even though according to regular English you're being covert, right? You're doing your covert singing operation. For the psychology of learning, it's an overt behavior. Because even if it's not observed by others, it has the potential to be observed by others. So even though you might have gone through all these precautions to make sure that it's not observed, it still could possibly be observed by somebody if they were there, right? So it's a behavior that could be observed. So it's not whether or not it is observed, it's all about whether it could potentially be directly observed by someone other than the person performing the action. So that's an overt behavior. So here, just to give you another example, for this individual here, her smile is an overt behavior. It has the potential to be observed. Somebody other than herself can take a look at her face and say, yes, she is smiling. I can observe that behavior. The other form of behavior, covert behavior, is the opposite of the overt behavior. This is behavior that can be perceived only by the person that is performing the behavior. So this is something that other people cannot perceive, even if they were there. So this individual here might be smiling on the outside, but on the inside, she might be thinking to herself, you know, this is the saddest I've ever been. Today has been horrible. I'm going to paint this smile on my face to hide my inner thoughts from the world. That's a behavior, right? Those thoughts constitute an actual behavior, but they cannot be observed. They don't have the potential to be observed. We can't observe those particular thoughts. We might observe the consequences of those thoughts, right? So later on, she might start crying. Later on, she might be very agitated at other individuals. But we cannot observe the actual thought behavior of her inner mind. Things like emotions oftentimes are covert. So if you're experiencing an emotion, but you put up a brave front, that emotion cannot be observed. So somebody does not have an emotionoscope that they can put on and say, okay, all right, no, I see that you have this secret emotion that I've just observed. We don't have that technology. So inner thoughts, inner emotions are often your typical examples of that covert behavior, because that can only be perceived by the person that is doing it. So you yourself can introspect and say, how am I feeling? I'm feeling pretty good today. But other people cannot directly observe that feeling good that you can. All right, so keep those in mind. Overt and covert behavior. Again, especially the covert behavior, it means something very specific in psychology of learning. It's not secretive behavior. It's not something that you try to hide. It's something that cannot be observed. So an example of that we encountered, this woman, if you remember from the last class that we saw, she was addicted to slot machines. She embezzled $250,000 from her employer to cover her gambling addiction. And she did all of this in secret, right? She was hiding all of it. However, that embezzling, that addiction was overt behavior. Because even though it wasn't observed for a long time, it had the potential to be observed. Somebody could possibly see that embezzling behavior. And sure enough, somebody eventually did see the embezzling behavior, and she ended up getting arrested. And I actually don't know if she went to jail, but she ended up getting arrested for her embezzlement. All right, any questions on covert, overt, and the distinction between those? Okay. Next one, appetitive and aversive stimuli. This is also something that is a very specific definition in the psychology of learning, And this one really differs from what is typical, the way that these words are typically used in the English language. So, an appetitive stimulus. If I was to ask you before this class, what's an appetitive stimulus? You might say, well, it's something that you like, right? It's something that you find enjoyable. That's what an appetitive stimulus is, right? That's the way that our society uses this word in English. What an appetitive stimulus means for a psychologist, and the way that we're going to use it in this class, it is a stimulus that an organism will seek out. It is, an event that an organism will seek out. It's an event that an organism will approach, try to get near to, that'll actively get closer to. That's what an appetitive stimulus is. So it has nothing to do with whether they like the event or they don't like the event. It has nothing to do with whether it's a positive event, like it's a good thing for them, or it's a bad thing for them. All it has to do is with whether or not they will seek it out. They'll try to get near it, try to get more of it. That's what an appetitive stimulus is. And an aversive stimulus is the complete opposite of that. An aversive stimulus is not something that you don't like. It's something that you're actively trying to avoid. It's an event that an organism will try to get away from, try to avoid, try to distance themselves from. That's an aversive stimulus. So those are the definitions, and it's very important to remember those in the psychology of learning, because we all know what appetitive and aversive mean in the regular English language. That's not what it means in the psychology of learning. And another thing about appetitive and aversive stimuli is they're defined with respect to the organism. They're defined with respect to the individual. So the same event can be aversive or appetitive to different people. So take, for example, exams. Some people actively try to avoid exams, right? Some students will do anything that they can to avoid an exam. So exam day comes, and all of a sudden their grandmother falls ill, and they just have to go, be with her at the hospital, and they just can't make it to the exam. For some people, they want to actively avoid those exams. I remember reading a tweet from a professor who said that her requirement for makeup exams was an oral exam afterwards. Like if you mix her exam, you would have to do an oral exam with her afterwards, and she figures she saved like 6 or 7 grandmas that semester because they didn't have to go to the hospital. But some students will actively avoid exams. Other students love exams. Other students are like, you know what, I've been studying for this exam. I know it inside and out. I'm going to go in there. I'm going to rock this A+. I'm going to get into grad school. Give me that exam. Let's do it today. Oh, it's not today. It's next week. I'll take it right now. They love exams. It's an appetitive stimulus for them. So for some, aversive stimulus, try to avoid. For others, appetitive stimulus, try to get close to it. And this is going to be very important when we try to make sense of different types of behavior, because remember that it's appetitive or aversive depending upon whether you approach it, try to get near it, or whether you try to avoid it. So one example that we're going to see in this class, we're going to take a look at a case study that uses a lot of the concepts that we're going to look at in this course to treat an individual who has a self-injurious behaviors. So this is the individual. This is Harry here. This is filmed through a one-way. This is a screen grab filmed through a one-way mirror, so you can't really see it too clearly. But there's his head right there. And what you can almost make out is that he is literally smacking himself in the head as just his negative behavior. He has this inappropriate way of behaving where he injures himself in order to get what he desires. It's basically an extreme form of when a child holds their breath because they're not getting their way, and they're literally saying, I'm going to hold my breath until I die. You buy me the chocolate bar. You're like, all right, give it your best shot. Right? they're literally saying, I'm going to injure myself until I get my way. Well, he was actually very adept at that, and he would. He had his nose, we're going to see his nose is permanently disfigured. He would bite himself, hit himself, and he did this so much that one of the only ways that they found to decrease his injurious behavior was to put him in restraints. So over a variety of years, he wore different restraints on his arms. You know, he actually wore straitjackets at some point. And if you asked yourself, if somebody told me, I'm going to put you in restraints, right, would you actively seek that out? Or would you actively try to avoid it? And most of us are probably going to try to avoid it. Most of us don't like to have our arms locked up or be put in a straitjacket. Most of us would find that an aversive stimulus, right? Something that you would want to avoid. And you can tell because nobody's wearing a straitjacket in this room right now, right? We don't seek it out. However, one of their breakthroughs in treating him was figuring out that his restraints were actually an appetitive stimulus for Harry. He wanted to be in restraints. And if you gave them restraints on a table, he would go to those restraints and put them on. He actively sought them out. He approached his restraints, and that's how we knew that they were an appetitive stimulus. So if you, again, just thought about, well, what do people like? You would say, well, that's not going to be an appetitive stimulus. Nobody wants to be, restrained this way. We like our freedom of limbs. But for Harry, he actively approached this, and the psychologists that were treating him were able to say, you know what, that's an appetitive stimulus for Harry, and they were able to use it then in their treatment. So another example that we already encountered back to this individual here. When they were describing her and the other women that were addicted to slot machines, when they were describing the slot machines, almost none of it was positive. It was almost all like, these slot machines are horrible. If you remember the other one, they're like, they take your soul, they take your heart, and if you listen to them, you would say, wow, you guys really hate slot machines, right? You dislike slot machines. Incredibly, slot machines sound like they're very aversive to you. Yes, in the typical English understanding, but not in the psychology of learning. In the psychology of learning, as much as they hated slot machines, as much as they looked at them and said, oh my gosh, these slot machines ruined my life, they're an appetitive stimulus because they would seek out the slot machines. They would try to get to the casino. They would try to get close to the slot machines. That means that the slot machines were an appetitive stimulus, regardless of how much they professed, and actually probably did, hate these slot machines. If you approach something, that makes it an appetitive stimulus. All right, so that's appetitive and aversive stimuli. Next up, we got establishing operations. So an establishing operation is a procedure that affects the appetitiveness or the aversiveness of a stimulus. So remember that I mentioned it can differ between different people. It can also differ for the same person at different times. So an establishing operation is any procedure that you can do to change an appetitive stimulus into an aversive stimulus or vice versa. So something like studying for an exam is an establishing operation. Because before you study, you might say to yourself, oh my gosh, I don't want to take this exam. But then after you're fully prepared, you might say, yes, let's do this exam, let's do it now. So that studying changed it from being something that you would try to avoid to being something that you would actively try to seek, from being aversive to appetitive. We're going to see that through Harry's history of reinforcement, through Harry's history of learning, his restraints actually went from being aversive to being an appetitive stimulus. So this history of learning changed them from being something that he would try to avoid to being something that he would actively seek out. And just to give you one more kind of everyday example, this semester, almost all of you, will go through establishing operations on Thanksgiving Day. So if you've ever had a feast on Thanksgiving, you know that right when you sit at that table, that turkey is an appetitive stimulus. You're like, yes, I want some, give me some. I want some on my plate. I'll take some potatoes, I'll take some pie, I'll take some gravy, I'll take some of this. After your second, third plate, when somebody says, would you like more turkey? What do you say? You say, no, get that away from me. I can't do it anymore. I'm done, right? It's aversive. Please remove it from my vicinity. So it's gone from being appetitive through the establishing operation of ingesting 6,000 calories. It's become aversive. So that's an establishing operation, changing something from either appetitive to aversive or vice versa. All right, contingency and contiguity. So, reverse, contiguity and contingency. So we'll talk about contiguity first. And contiguity is a very important concept because it has large effects on the outcomes of learning. So that's one of the reasons why we're highlighting it here. And what it is, it's a closeness or a nearness of events. It's basically a measure of how close together two different events have occurred. So that closeness or nearness is oftentimes of one of two varieties. So that closeness or nearness can be temporal contiguity or spatial contiguity. So the temporal contiguity, that is a closeness or nearness together in time. So that's the temporal aspect of that contiguity. So if you get one event and then immediately after that second event occurs, those two events are very temporally contiguous. They have high temporal contiguity, there we go. They're close together in time. So this is an important concept because for the vast majority of learning, the higher your temporal contiguity, the more effective the learning is. So I'll say that one more time. For the vast majority of learning, the higher the temporal contiguity, the more effective learning is. So if you are the parent of a child and you want to decrease a bad behavior, let's say that your child is drawing on the walls and you want to decrease them for that, you're going to punish them, you're going to put them in timeout every time you catch them drawing on the walls. It is much more effective if the punishment of timeout is highly temporally contiguous to the drawing on the walls. So if your child is drawing on the walls and you catch them in the act and you say, no, you're getting timeout for drawing on the walls, into your timeout chair, and then you sit there. They were drawing and immediately they got put into timeout. That's high temporal contiguity. That instance of timeout is going to help decrease drawing on the walls substantially. On the other hand, if you walk into a room where your child was an hour ago, and you walk into that room and you're like, oh no, they drew on the wall. And then you go to the child and you say, all right, you get timeout, here you go. You drew on the wall, you get, go into your timeout chair. Drawing on the wall was over here, the punishment is over here, there's a full hour between those two. That timeout period is not going to be very effective at all. It loses its effectiveness because of that low temporal contiguity. And we've already encountered temporal contiguity in the gambling addiction. So if you remember when this researcher was talking about the addictiveness of slot machines, one of the things that she mentioned was the immediacy of the reward. So slot machines are more addictive than any other form of gambling. That's why they were featured on this particular report. More people are addicted to slot machines than to any other form of gambling. And part of that has to do with the immediacy, the temporal contiguity, the high temporal contiguity of how the slot machine works. So you put in your money, you press your button, and within about 5 seconds, it's like ding, ding, ding. You're like, oh, okay, I'm getting rewarded. I won some money. So a high temporal contiguity between the behavior of placing a bet and the reward of winning on that bet. Compare that to other forms of gambling. If you play roulette, you place your bets on the table, the croupier goes, no more bets, they spin the ball, and you wait, and you sit there, and it's like 20, 30 seconds before the ball falls into one of the slots, and you're like, okay, I either won or I didn't win. Roulette is not as addictive because the temporal contiguity is lower between those two events, placing your bets and getting your reward. If you play poker, sometimes poker has very frustrating temporal contiguities. So you're playing an opponent, you make your bet, and the opponent sits there and they're like, I'm not going to take it too far. And you got to call time, you got to call the tournament manager over and call time on them or whatever. There's a high temporal contiguity between you placing your bet and you getting the reward of winning the pot. It takes a long time. Not as addictive. Poker became way more addictive, though, when people were playing it online, because online, shuffling is immediate. Online, people are way quicker to punch in their values. It's way more addictive online because the speed of play is higher, the temporal contiguity is higher as well. So temporal contiguity is a very important concept, and in general, there are exceptions, but in general, the closer two events are, the more learning will occur between those events, the more of an association you will form. The other form of contiguity that's important, very important for learning, is spatial contiguity. So spatial contiguity is the closeness in space, the closeness in distance, physical distance, between the behavior that occurred and the reward, for example, that followed. Those two events that are occurring together. So once again, this helps explain why slot machines are very addictive, because the payouts are oftentimes right there, right? So you press the button, the tumblers stop, and you get your money, your tokens fall out right there. If you win a big jackpot, you can print out the ticket right there. You can get your payout right there. There's very high spatial contiguity. They're very close together in space. If you take a look at something else like horse betting. In horse betting, you go to a window, you place your bets. You then go and you sit down and you watch it on a screen. Once you win, you have to go back to that window in order to collect your money. The distance between where you were sitting when you won and where you had to go to collect your money is huge. That is low spatial contiguity. That's less effective in terms of learning. So typically, high spatial, high temporal contiguity, more effective learning. We will see exceptions to that rule, though, but keep those ideas in mind. Closeness in time, closeness in space, those are the contiguity concepts. All right. Couple more before we return to learned helplessness. So contingency is a functional relationship between two events. It's a relationship between one event occurring and another event occurring. So the definition of that is when the occurrence of one event predicts the probable occurrence of another event. That's when you have a contingency. So these contingencies are oftentimes unseen, but they're there. Oftentimes there's natural contingencies. Sometimes they're 100%. You do this, and for sure this occurrence will follow. Sometimes they're not 100%, and it's just probable. You do this, and it's likely that this would occur. Or you do this, and it increases the probability that this will occur. So an example of a contingency that we all live under is gravity. So if I take this and I drop it, the very highly probable occurrence is that it's going to fall onto the table, right? So we live under the contingency of gravity. You drop something, very high probability that it's going to fall down to the table, right? That probability is probably 100%, but we never know when gravity is going to do something weird. But anyways, that's a philosophy of science thing. That's not important here. It's important, though, to understand that it's just a prediction of the probable occurrence. It doesn't have to occur every single time. So one contingency that we've seen is a contingency that if you break the law, then you increase the probability of getting arrested, right? So breaking the law predicts the probable occurrence that you're going to get arrested. And we saw it with this individual here. She embezzled $250,000, which means that she did not get caught the first time she embezzled money. She did not get caught the second time she embezzled money. She did not get caught the third time she embezzled money. But this behavior, this event of embezzling increased the probability, that's the contingency, it increased the probability that she was going to get arrested. And it could have been that it didn't happen at all. She might have gotten away with it. But in fact, it increased it to the probability where it actually occurred. She did get arrested. So just bear in mind that it doesn't have to be an exact all the time occurrence. It's just that probable occurrence. So if you study for an exam, that increases the probable outcome that you're going to do well on that exam. We've all had that experience where that didn't occur. We studied for an exam and we didn't do well. But if you study for it, it increases the probability that you're going to do well on the exam. There is a contingency, a functional relationship between studying and doing well on an exam. All right, so any questions on any of those terms that we've looked at so far, any of those concepts? All right, so what we're going to do to wrap up today's class is we're going to revisit learned helplessness, and then I will leave it as an exercise that we'll take up next time to analyze learned helplessness using some of the concepts that we looked at today. So once more with learned helplessness, so we got Martin P. Seligman doing this study where he wanted to see the effects of prior learning on subsequent learning. So would learning something first influence how you learn something else later on? And for this experiment, he took dogs and he split them up into 3 groups. So he manipulated these dogs into 3 different groups, and he controlled whether the dogs received no shock. So dogs in group A, he said, you are going to receive no shock when I put you into this room. Dogs in group B, you're going to receive escapable shock. So the dogs in group A, they were put into a room and they just wandered for a certain amount of time and then they were taken out of the room. The dogs in group B, individually, they would be placed into a room. The floor would start to be shocked and there was a panel on the side of the wall, and if they pressed the panel, the shock would turn off. So they had escapable shock. And group C, they had inescapable shock. And importantly for group C, their shock was tied directly to the escapable shock dogs. So it was as if there were 2 different rooms, one with group B and one with a group C dog, and both rooms would start to get shocked at the same time, and both rooms would turn off when group B pressed the panel. So that was a really smart move, because what it meant was that these 2 dogs here received exactly the same amount of shock. So there was no difference in the amount of shock. It was just whether you could escape it or not escape it. And as it turned out, the no-shock dogs, there was nothing to learn. There was no contingency between shock and any behavior. The escapable shock, there was a contingency. You press the panel, you escape the shock. So they were able to learn to press that panel. And the inescapable shock, there was no contingency there. There was no rule. They didn't learn to press the panel because the panel did nothing. So that was part 1. And then part 2 looked at how are these dogs going to learn in a new environment, a new situation. So he placed them into what's called a shuttle box. And this shuttle box had two separate compartments that were separated by this hurdle here. And what would happen is a tone would sound from a speaker, and shortly after the tone sounded, the floor would start to get shocked, and then the dog could jump over to the other side in order to escape the shock. And if the dog could learn that the tone signaled the shock, then the dog could jump over to the other side and completely avoid the shock. So the question was, would the prior learning in part 1 affect the subsequent learning here in part 2? So what he found, what were the results of this, was that group A was very able to learn this jumping response to escape the shock. They were able to learn to jump over that hurdle to escape the shock from the floor. Group B was also able to avoid that escapable shock. And I will have to do more research on this to see if their learning was any different than the no-shock group, because I find it hard to believe that they would not be looking for that panel when they first started to get shocked. But importantly, they were eventually able to learn to jump over to the other side. The big result was that Group C was unable to learn to escape the shock. So even though they were now operating under a contingency where if you just jumped over to the other side, you could escape that particular shock, they were in general unable to learn this new behavior, having their learning affected by the fact that they could not escape the shock in the initial part 1. All right, so that's a brief recap. And as I mentioned before, this experiment was crucial in developing theories on learned helplessness, developing theories that led to new treatments for depression, and actually in developing an entire branch of psychology called positive psychology, which is the psychology not of taking people with behavior or mental disorders and bringing them back to normal, but the psychology of taking people at a normal functioning level and making them super resilient, super memory, super not depressed. Basically, bodybuilding for your mind and behavior. All right, so that was the experiment. So what we're going to do next class is we're going to take up the answers to the following questions. So we learned a lot of terms for this in this class. So what I'd like you to do is between now and next class, just try to write your answers down to this. I find that is a lot more effective in seeing whether you understand a concept or not. So for next class, just write down the answers to these. So what are the independent and dependent variables for this experiment for part 1 and for part 2? So what were the independent variables? What were the variables that the experimenter themselves manipulated in part 1? What were the dependent variables that the experimenter measured in part 1 that freely allowed the dogs to do in part 1? And then what were the independent variables in part 2? That one is a little bit trickier. And what was the dependent measure in part 2? What did they measure in terms of what the dogs could do? What was dependent upon their behavior? All right, what are the stimuli and the responses? What were the events that could potentially influence behavior, the stimuli? And then what were the responses? What were those particular instances of behavior that they were looking for? And also maybe speculate what are some instances of behavior that they might not have focused on but might have still occurred during these experiments. In terms of overt and covert behaviors, so for overt behaviors, what were the behaviors of the dogs that could potentially be viewed? So there are some ones that were mentioned. There's other ones that you could just kind of speculate based on what you know about dogs' behaviors. And then for the covert behaviors, those will have to be pure speculation because we have no way of observing what was going on inside the dogs. But if you want to kind of imagine what it might be like to be in that situation, try to put yourself in those dogs' paws and see if you could identify some covert behaviors that were likely happening. All right, appetitive and aversive stimuli. So for part 1 and part 2, what were some appetitive stimuli? So what were objects, events that dogs were actively trying to get closer to, actively seeking out? What were aversive stimuli, things that dogs were trying to actively avoid or get away from for parts 1 and part 2? And for some of these, they might not exist for certain groups. So for example, the appetitive stimuli in the first part, in part 1, just to kind of give you a hint, the appetitive stimulus doesn't exist for group A and group C. It only exists for group B. Okay, so keep that in mind. These things might not exist for all 3 groups in every single instance. Temporally contiguous events for part 1 and part 2. What 2 events occurred almost immediately one after another in part 1? What 2 events occurred almost immediately one after another in part 2? And then spatially contiguous events. For part 2, use that image of a shuttle box that I gave you to kind of figure out the spatial location of different stimuli. For part 1, you'll have to just speculate a little bit on what the room looked like. We don't have a picture of that. So what does a room look like in terms of different events that occurred? And then the contingency between the shock and the behavior for group A, B, and group C in both parts 1 and part 2. So what were the contingencies? Some of them are going to be when this occurred, then this would occur. For other groups, there is no contingency, especially in part 1. So write those down for what you think they might be. And then finally, the functional relationship between the independent and dependent variable for part 2 only. See if you can, it's not going to be in graph form here because it's a little more abstract, but see if you can write out what is the relationship between prior learning on subsequent learning, and that's only for part 2. So what was the effect of the independent variable of prior learning on the dependent variable of subsequent learning? All right, so any questions before we wrap up for today? All make sense? All right, so that's all that I wanted to do for today. So next time, we're going to pick up where we left off those terms. I'll take those up at the beginning of the class, and we'll continue on with the semester. And before we leave, I did send Canvas messages. So what I saw was that there were 2 different classes that people had enrolled in. And one of them, the correct one, the majority of you had enrolled in. The other one, I think there was about like 12 students that had enrolled in that. Thankfully, some of you did not start any assignments in that, but some of you did. So what I'm going to do is I sent everybody an email who was in that other group that was in the incorrect classroom. Use the Canvas link through the modules to get into the correct group. If it links you to 2, it's not the P325 one, it's the Introduction to Learning one. So I put all that into the Canvas messages. If you've already completed work, I just want to make sure that everybody knew about this. If you already completed work in the wrong section, don't feel that you have to redo it in the correct section. I will access the scores for the incorrect section before it goes away. So don't worry about that. So if you've already completed, say, the pre-test in the incorrect section, that's fine. I'll take your grade there, and you don't have to do it again. But make sure that you are getting into that correct section. Check your Canvas messages. I did send it to everybody that's in the wrong section. And other than that, if there's no questions, I'm done for the day.